Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Today I'm in the Focus Gallery at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art with Cheryl Hartup and Danielle Knapp. Cheryl Hartup is the Curator of Academic Programs and Latin America and Caribbean Art at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art. Danielle Knapp is the McCosh Curator at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art. Together, Hartup and Knapp curated the museum's Common Seeing exhibition, Resistance as Power, a curatorial response to Under the Feet of Jesus, which is on view through February 23, 2020. Under the Feet of Jesus, a novel by Helena Maria Viramontes, is the 2019-2020 Common Reading Selection for University of Oregon first-year students. Thank you both for coming on the show.
Thank you.
So this is the museum's fourth Common Seeing exhibit. Why does the museum organize them?
Well, this is an opportunity to do something that is really central to our mission, to support the academic mission of the U of O, and an opportunity to engage the different areas that we work in across our curatorial areas and really question some of the works in our collection and look for loans that will enhance conversations that are being held campus-wide. So in response to the Common Reading assigned book, Cheryl and I, for the last 3 years, and the first year when Jill Hartz, our retired director, and a student intern, Amelia Anderson, created the first sort of iteration of this program. This is a chance for us to engage with what's happening around campus on a level where we can be directly working with students and faculty to bring some of these themes to light with visual art.
So let's talk about this particular book, Viramontes, Under the Feet of Jesus. So what are some of the themes of that book that you were trying to engage with this show?
Well, we're very fortunate to work closely with members of the university community who are identifying themes early on during the book selection process. Julie Volker-Morris has been a partner for us through all of the years of this program. And so for this book specifically, in working with all of the faculty and students who were identifying a book that would speak to themes of environmental justice, family relationships, migrant worker issues, the list sort of goes on once you open up this novel. There are so many ways that it's touching on important topics that resonate across campus.
So those are the themes. So the first place you go is the museum's collection. So tell us which of the works here are from the museum's collection, the permanent collection?
Well, we have recent acquisitions. The Fallen by V. Maldonado. Also, Sun Mad by Esther Hernandez is a recent acquisition to the collection. And Lilian Nieves' Beauty Queen No. 4, Taladro. And we also included 2 prints by Betty Leduc. We have a number of her works in our collection. And some of the criteria we were thinking about in terms of the selection, because we have so many works in our collection that relate to these themes, we wanted to include a number of women artists because of the protagonist in the book, Estrella and Petra, her mother, are such strong figures. So we have 3 women artists in the show. And we also wanted works to address the various themes. And what was interesting once we started digging into the biographies of a number of the artists is that they grew up either in a migrant worker family in the San Joaquin Valley or in the Midwest, or were migrant workers themselves and later became artists.
So let's talk about some of the specific pieces. So let's start with Betty Leduc. So much of her career, she's addressed social justice in her heart. So these 2 prints that are from the collection that you've chosen, what's she responding to in these prints? How do they engage with the themes that you're talking about?
Oh, do you want to answer?
Well, Betty, as an Oregon artist, she's been in Ashland since the 1960s, came to teach at what is now Southern Oregon University, and been really instrumental in sort of changing the way that the community and students there talk about the arts, the role of women in the arts, and preserving cultural heritage from around the world. So she's an artist who spent time in Mexico in the 1950s. That really made an impression on her and kind of set her life and her career on a course of wanting to engage with communities and help communities share their stories. And so with the works in our collection that speak to her experiences in the 80s, traveling throughout Latin America and Mexico, we were really drawn to the images of strong female figures in those works, kind of building on what Cheryl mentioned about the story itself and wanting to show how one artist has sort of captured that visually. And then Betty, being the only artist in the show who is not of Latinx heritage, did not grow up speaking Spanish, but is the child of immigrants and grew up in the Bronx to parents who were from Europe. And so she has a sensitivity to that experience of being someone who has a multicultural background, living in a world where you might be speaking different languages, and how she's taken that sensitivity and compassion to her world travels and shared those stories of what she's learned in her own work is really compelling.
So we're sitting in front of V. Maldonado's painting, The Fallen. So tell us a little bit about that painting.
This is a work that we were really fortunate to purchase with a major grant from the Ford Family Foundation and the Oregon Arts Commission a couple of years ago. It's our first opportunity to have it on view. V. Maldonado has been an artist of interest to both Cheryl and me for several years for our collection. And this work is from one of their most recent bodies of work as they're expanding into large painting. So Maldonado, who's also an assistant dean of diversity and inclusions at Pacific Northwest College of Art in Portland, does a lot of work about identity, their own life growing up, sort of in two worlds, living in Mexico and living in California as a child and traveling to Mexico frequently to visit with family. And in a lot of their performance work has taken on this alter ego of Mad Mex, like a Mexican wrestling figure. So in looking at The Fallen, although it's initially when you look at it, you're kind of overwhelmed by all the bright colors and the energy of the painting, sort of faces and masks start to appear, and the title, you begin to sort of put together an understanding of what you're looking at. There seems to be a fallen wrestler figure. And I think Mad Mex and that imagery has been a way for them to think about sort of the way that you're at contrasts in your own life, masculinity and femininity. In wrestling, it's really simple, good versus evil, the victor versus the loser. But that really translates to so much that we're doing in our own life, the haves versus the have-nots, all of these different categories that you might feel you're placed in, the minority, the majority. And in doing large paintings, he has said, that's sort of a political act too, as a minority. If you're working in spaces that weren't made for you, weren't made for people that look like you or speak like you, one of the things that you need to do is take up space. So in a museum gallery setting, a large painting will physically take up space, but it's a very purposeful decision on their part.
Fascinating. So behind me over here is Esther Hernandez, Sun Mad, which is a response to the very iconic Sun-Made Raisins label. So tell us a little bit about the differences between Hernandez's revision and the original.
We're so excited to have this work come into the collection because there's a passage in the book that talks about this exact image that's on the box of raisins. So Sun-Made Raisins on the box, it's very wholesome, young, white woman who looks like she's never worked a day in the grape fields. And it's this bountiful gesture of offering the harvest. And in Sun Mad, Esther Hernandez takes that image of youth and health and turns it into death. And if someone doesn't read English or read, they can still get the message from this print. And that was something very important, both the Mexican printmaking tradition, which this is also commenting on, as well as the Chicano print movement in the United States in the 60s and 70s. So when you read the fine print down below, underneath Sun Mad Raisins, it says unnaturally grown with, and then lists all of the poisons, the pesticides that are used in the fields. And Esther Hernandez grew up in a town where all the grapes went to Sun-Made, the corporation, and she made this print out of anger and fear of these poisons leaching into the water. And what's interesting on the box of raisins, we were looking at one the other day, it says, just grapes and sunshine. So that's the advertising, but we know that it's so much more, and that's what Viramontes' book also does, is all the labor that goes into picking the grapes, and also the pesticides that are used on them.
So 31 years after Hernandez creates Sun Mad, she designs Sun Raid, which is yet another version, another revision. Tell us about that image.
Well, that image, it's still the skeleton, so it's still the calavera, and she's wearing a huipil, or an indigenous blouse, beautifully embroidered. So talking about many indigenous people from Central America and Mexico coming to the United States, escaping violence, oppression, hunger, and looking to have better opportunities here. And also, if you look closely, she's wearing a bracelet, and it says ICE on it, so it's like a tracking device. And it mentions the different indigenous groups at the bottom who are coming to raise awareness and to talk about social justice issues.
So a number of the other pieces are on loan. So tell us about where some of these other pieces are from, and then we'll talk about them specifically. There's a number of really interesting partnerships for those loans.
Well, two of the works are loans from the Smithsonian American Art Museum collection, and this came to us as a great opportunity. Our museum was selected as one of a 5 Western Museum partnership to work with the Smithsonian and the Terra Foundation for American Art and Arts Bridges over the next 5 years on a collection sharing initiative. So phase 1 of that project allowed us to go to their curators and say, these are works that we would like to borrow to include in this exhibition. In this case, we asked for Domingo Ulloa's Braceros and Emmanuel Martinez Farm Workers Altar, and amazingly, they were able to come to us for the duration of this show. And through that project, we're getting to take advantage of access to the Smithsonian collection, but they're also getting to see their works shown in a context with works that are important to us or in our collection. And so there's a great conversation happening among the works there. And then a special loan from an artist who was perhaps the best Chicana sculptor in the Pacific Northwest, Ruben Trejo. And that was on loan from his family. He passed away several years ago, and we don't have his work in the collection. And so it was important to us to include his story in this exhibition through a special loan.
So let's talk about Braceros first. So first of all, tell us what the Braceros program was, and then let's talk a little bit about the significance of the painting.
Well, the Braceros program was a U.S. government work program for migrant workers. After World War II, there was a shortage of American men to work in agriculture and on the railroad. And so the government was giving work permits to primarily Mexican laborers who were known as braceros because of reference to arms, so manual laborers. But the program itself was known as the Braceros program. And so workers would leave their families, come to the U.S. There were camps throughout the country, especially California, Texas, in the Midwest, and work for a period of time. In the first couple of years of the program, conditions were somewhat better for the workers, especially during that initial worker shortage. As years went on, as sort of attitudes and politics changed towards Mexicans in the United States, certainly the conditions got worse and worse in terms of racism that they encountered, bigotry they encountered, but also the problems of overcrowded living conditions for the workers in the worker camps. They didn't have access to healthy foods, clean water all the time, often waiting for paychecks. And so the situation was often sort of a desperate situation for workers who were contributing to keeping America running, keeping the labor cycle running in the U.S. during that time. And the artist who painted this work had visited Holtzville, California in 1960, saw workers at a labor camp there. Ulloa was himself a veteran of World War II, and so in making this work, visually thinking about the plight of the men depicted here who he'd met, but also that imagery we associate barbed wire with, and thinking of concentration camps and the internment of Japanese Americans. And when students come to look at this artist's work in the gallery, they're often immediately making connections to images they've seen in present day in the news and what they know is going on with border issues. And this is the work that when Helena Maria Viramontes came in the gallery and she stood before it, she really responded heavily to it, because she said, this is exactly what I'm trying to do in my writing, is make these stories of people like me, make their stories visible. And she felt that the artist had achieved that in this work.
Yeah, so let's take a moment, because you mentioned that Viramontes came and saw the show. She was a visitor to the university, and she gave a talk and met with students, and she also took a tour of the show. Did she say anything else about any of the other particular? She must have been resonated with the Sun Mad, since it's amazing that her book almost anticipates that image. Did she, any other interesting parts of that visit for you guys?
The thing we should point out about Sun Mad, too, is that print was made before the book was written. So not only was she familiar with the box of raisins and that wholesome imagery, but also Esther Hernandez's work and the power of sort of that visual protest against Sun Mad's campaign of wholesomeness was known to the author, and she really responded to Lilian Nieves' work.
Yeah, she loved the show. It was so great to, with the Common Sing program here, we love to have the work, resonate with the book and spark more dialogue, more conversation, and to have the author be inspired by the works of art and say that their writing will be inspired by that was just a huge compliment.
Yeah, I get choked up thinking about it still, because it was very touching, and it really speaks to the heart of what we're trying to do. Is all the students who come in the show, we want them to have that personal connection as well. And for visitors who maybe, if they're not a first-year student and they haven't had that book placed in their hands, maybe they're experiencing the show and have never read, will never read the book. So the artwork has to show those themes strongly enough that they can stand on their own outside of Viramontes' beautiful writing.
But I should say, anyone who comes to see the show, they will see the book
Yes.
in the room, so they will be tempted or prompted to read it.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit more, let's talk about Emmanuel Martinez's Farm Workers' Altar. What's important about that work? It's really interesting.
Yes, so that work was created in the months leading up to Cesar Chavez breaking his 25-day water-only fast in California. It took place in March 1968. The artist who made that work was a really young emerging artist. I think he was 19 when he was working on that. And it's a piece that is doing a lot to speak to sort of all the issues that Martinez was observing happening in his world, the labor rights movement and the plight of workers, especially working in the grape fields, but also thinking about this sort of cultural mixed heritage and the experience of people who looked like him, who looked like a lot of the farm workers, and the imagery includes both indigenous imagery that speaks to Mexico's history, as well as Christian imagery and iconography. And so in all the sides of that altar, we can talk about with students and visitors, what is the artist trying to say in these images, and how might that be getting a political message across in 1968, because he was such a strong supporter of what Chavez and Dolores Huerta were fighting for in their labor rights movement.
So you've just, in passing, you mentioned the piece by Lilian Nieves. What's interesting about, well, there are many things that are interesting, but one of the things that's interesting about this piece is that she created it while she was visiting here. So why don't you tell us about that?
Well, the former director, Jill Hartz, and I, we took a trip to San Juan, Puerto Rico, and visited Lilian's studio. I had known her since about 2005, and I fell in love with a piece I wanted to acquire for our collection, but then when we started looking at how much it would cost to bring a very large piece of hardwood from Puerto Rico to Eugene, Oregon, Lilian had the brilliant idea. She said, well, why don't I just come and make a piece on campus, and it'll probably be less, and it was. So she came in July, and the art department was very generous and gave her a studio for a week. And we were thinking about her creating a work in response to the book. So we told her about the book, and she read part of it. And gave us a few ideas for this commission, and we chose the one where she's holding the drill, the taladro, because tools are so important in the novel in terms of agency, and here definitely in this work as well. So she worked and met with Spanish language classes and spoke to them entirely in Spanish. And they got to see her process and hear her talk about her work. And what's been really great is that some of these students now are coming through with another class to see the exhibit, and they can't believe that what they saw in the summer in process is actually in an art museum, you know, leaning against the wall. But she picked out this wonderful cherry panel and then drilled lines into it and inked it. And it's a self-portrait of her as a beauty queen. So she's commenting on beauty pageants in Puerto Rico, and also just, you know, idealized feminine beauty, stereotypes of beauty queens. And the drill, which she uses, and she's standing on top of the world, and one foot is firmly planted in Europe. So referencing the colonial past of Puerto Rico. And the other combat boot is kind of inclined in the ocean, maybe touching an island. So also talking about this precariousness of coming and going and dispersal of separations of families, and how things, you know, are so tenuous because of either the weather, you know, things that we see in the book too. So we're so happy to acquire this work by her.
So the last piece that we haven't spoken about is Ruben Trejo's Roots sculpture. So tell us about that sculpture.
Well, I recently had a wonderful conversation with one of his daughters, Tanya Trejo, about this piece. It's from the early 80s, and it's called Roots. So roots is something, both, you know, the roots of what people are collecting out of the earth in the book, but also personal roots, and these connections with Mexico or other countries, the roots of your family. So it raises a lot of questions about that. And I think it's kind of the height of the artist. I almost see it as another self-portrait, opposite the self-portrait of Lilian Nieves. And these roots are kind of closed off in this glass box. And so you're looking to something that maybe is going to be preserved, maybe it's in the process of dying and drying out. They're definitely separated from the earth. But you notice his love of working with wood, and also referencing various elements of fire and wind, the lack of water, and, you know, the earth in the piece. But he was a migrant worker and traveled a lot with his family. His father worked on the railroads. So roots for him come from many different places. Again, like Lilian's piece, Europe, the New World, Mexico, the U.S., and also the past, the indigenous past, as well as how indigenous culture is still, you know, alive today. So all of that are his roots. Yeah.
Fascinating. So tell us about some of the programming that the JSMA has organized in conjunction with the exhibit.
We're really fortunate to have received funding from Art Bridges to support doing some programs that would allow us to work closely with community partners and faculty partners that represent several community and university groups. We've worked closely with the faculty who are involved in the first Latinx Scholars Academic Residential Community here at the U of O, and as well as Eugene Arte Latino and other groups. We brought a Mexican photographer, Fernando Soto, here in October, right before our Day of the Dead celebrations, to talk about traditions of altars in his region of Mexico. And in winter term, we'll have a cultural worker from California, a Chicanx woman named Gilda Posada, who's coming to do a special printmaking program with the students in the Latinx Scholars Arc. And so we're really excited that our programming is going to allow us to kind of stretch what we can do and not just respond directly to the works that are on view here, but really engage with some communities about the larger themes and the artists that these works represent, and have some meaningful relationships built out of that, especially for students, where we want them to feel like the museum can be a cultural and social home for them. So providing opportunities like working with Gilda Posada will hopefully do that for this group of students this year.
So let's talk a little bit more about how the students so far have engaged with the exhibit. Do you have any stories to share?
Well, so far we've had over 1,300 students see the show since it went on view, so fall term. And that's about 40 classes that have come through, classes spanning anthropology, environmental studies, women, gender, and sexuality studies, Spanish language classes. And every time we tour the show, it's just so wonderful to hear student impressions of the work, and you see something new and you take, a new interpretation, a way that then we can share with another group, so it just kind of keeps building on one another. And for classes that are large, because we can only fit about 20, 25 comfortably in this space, we also bring them to our Gilkey Research Center, and we pull out about 20 more objects from our permanent collection, some prints, photographs, sometimes some sculpture, and just these are works that also reinforce the themes of the book. So it's been great, and it'll be on view through almost the end of February. So last year we had our all-time high of over 1,600. So we'll see what this year brings us. So.
Good luck. So this will be my last question. We just have a couple of seconds left. The Common Reading Program will be focusing on the theme of climate change, justice, and resilience for the next 2 academic years. They haven't chosen the books yet, or they haven't announced the books yet, but are you already beginning to look for works for those Common Seeing?
Absolutely. And I think that issues related to climate change and environmental change is present in a lot of artists' minds right now. So there are artists who we've already been engaging with and collecting with just because of the nature of their work. And it will be a sort of a natural way to dovetail with some artists that we've already been interested in curatorially to hopefully feature their work next fall when the next book comes out.
Well, we look forward to that. Thank you both so much for taking the time to speak with us today about this Common Seeing show, and I will urge everyone to come see it for themselves. Thanks so much. I've been speaking with curators Cheryl Hartup and Danielle Knapp. The Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art's Common Seeing exhibition, Resistance as Power, a Curatorial Response to Under the Feet of Jesus, is on view through February 23rd, 2020. Thanks so much for watching.